This is the story of a monster who killed 350 people. Because of his imaginary cruelty with which he dealt with his victims, even the mafia and drug cartel joined in his search. His name is included in the Guinness Book of Records, and this record has not yet been broken. But his biography is also a vivid example of how an unhappy childhood can turn an ordinary child into the most brutal serial killer of our days. Meet Pedro Alonso Lopez. Lopez was born in 1948 in the Colombian town of Santa Isabel. Life didn't work out in the first seconds. His mother was a prostitute who had already given birth to 12 children, and his father was a politician who loved to use escort services. However, the father did not have time to play any role in the fate of the future maniac. He was shot shortly after the birth of his son. At 8 years old, the boy's life changed dramatically. His mother found him in bed with his sister, after which she severely beat him and kicked him out of the house forever. As a result, the 8-year-old child found himself on the street, forced to look for food and a roof over his head in order to survive. One day, an adult man approached him, offering him food and shelter. Lopez immediately agreed. And this decision became one of the first mistakes that led the child to the path of a serial killer. Alas! The stranger turned out to be not at all a kind person who could not pass by the starving child. He took the boy to an abandoned building, where he sexually abused him for several months in a row. Sometimes he brought his friends, who also harmed the child. At one point, Lopez managed to escape and move to the capital of Colombia. At first, the boy tried to get food from garbage dumps, but he couldn't feed himself that way. Later he began to beg for alms and it bore fruit. A married couple from the United States noticed the child and took pity on him, taking him into their home. They also enrolled the boy in a school for orphans. Unfortunately, fate failed Lopez here too. When he was 12 years old, he was seduced by one of his teachers. The boy once again decided to run away, taking with him all the money from the school cash register. Over the next 6 years, he gradually plunged into the criminal world. First petty theft, then car theft. During this time, the young man became part of the criminal sphere. At the age of 18, he decided to take advantage of new connections and quench the thirst for revenge that had haunted him since he was 8. With the help of 7 friends, Lopez managed to track down the sadist who abused him as a child. For his sins, he received the perversion in full. Young criminals made his last days of life a real hell. Lopez later did the same with 3 more of the spinners who visited that ill-fated abandoned house. Having satisfied the feeling of revenge, Lopez continued to steal cars, but was soon caught by the police. During the investigation, they quickly established the young man's involvement in a recent series of murders. However, the court accepted his motives as mitigating circumstances. After the horror that the child was forced to go through as a child, cruel revenge no longer seemed such a serious crime. As a result, the judge took pity and sentenced him to 8 years in prison. Well, Lopez was unlucky there. Having learned about his past, his cellmates subjected him to violence. This time, Lopez's revenge was immediate. He waylaid 4 rapists in the toilet, killed 3 of them, and disabled the 4th. For this, 2 years were added to his term. But no more prisoners risked pestering him. After spending 10 years in prison, Lopez's psyche finally broke down. Throughout this time, he was fixated on his crippled fate and the reasons that made him so unhappy. As a result, he decided that the fault lay with his mother. Over time, hatred for her grew into hostility towards all women. And this resulted in one of the most terrible chains of murders in history. After leaving prison, he moved to Peru, where he began killing and raping girls. He acted so aggressively and brazenly that he soon fell into the hands of the inhabitants of one of the Indian settlements. They beat him to a pulp and then buried him up to his neck in sand. The police who arrived on the scene did not believe the locals, but still deported Lopez to Ecuador, since he did not have Peruvian citizenship. There he immediately took up his old ways and continued killing women. Soon, the mass disappearances of girls attracted the attention of the police, and they decided that they were being kidnapped for resale into slavery. Alas, in Latin America this problem is still relevant, let alone those years. The police would have continued to adhere to this version, but the maniac was unlucky again. The flood brought the buried bodies to the surface and everyone realized the terrible truth. There is a serial killer on the streets. Women disappeared by the dozens, and soon they were joined by young girls, the youngest of whom was only 7 years old. In a matter of hours, Lopez could have raped and killed 3 victims. At this stage, the mafia and cartels joined the search for the sadist. Even they were shocked by what was happening and wanted to put an end to the maniac who had targeted the Ecuadorian girls. The situation became so tense that almost every police officer was looking for Lopez. One day he lost caution, trying to kidnap another girl. She contacted the police, and the maniac was quickly captured. Luckily for the investigation, they had no evidence linking the murder. Therefore, they decided to resort to cunning. An undercover cellmate was placed in Lopez's cell, where he was placed during the investigation. His task was to gain the trust of the maniac and extract a confession. Surprisingly, this simple maneuver worked very quickly. Within a few days, Lopez told his new friend that he had killed more than 300 women in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He also detailed details of the murders that shocked the police. Lopez's tactics were simple. He found the girl and offered her a gift. After that, he took the victim to some abandoned house, where he subjected him to violence for a long time and later killed. To obtain pleasure, the sadist took their lives only during the day in order to clearly see the horror in their eyes. Sometimes he also abused the bodies and then buried them in a common grave. When the police revealed their trick with the cellmate, Lopez realized that he could not get away with it and did not hide anything. Moreover, the idea of becoming famous throughout the country attracted the maniac. During interrogation, he pointed the police to one of the graves, where shocked detectives discovered the bodies of 53 girls. From that moment on, everyone understood that they were facing the most terrible serial killers in Latin America, and perhaps the whole world. He himself directly said that he would continue to kill after prison, because for him it was an incomparable pleasure. During the interrogation, he was also asked why he switched from adult women to little girls, to which the maniac said, "I want to be their first and last man." Taking all this into account, he was immediately assigned a psychological examination, according to the results of which Lopez was declared fully sane. However, in the conclusion it was stated that the maniac is distinguished by a strong hatred of all people. However, this moment hardly surprises anyone, given his biography. Ultimately, the court was able to bring charges of murder and rape against 100 girls in Ecuador because the other victims were beyond their jurisdiction. And this is where the fun begins. The maximum prison term provided for by country's legislation is 20 years. That's how much Lopez received, despite his promise to continue killing after his release. But at this point the story becomes even more confusing. Different sources give their own versions of what happened to Lopez and there is no official confirmation in any of them. First version. After 16 years in prison, he was secretly transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Colombia, where he spent the remaining 4 years and was released. Such generosity of the justice system was allegedly associated with the exemplary behavior of the maniac and voluntary cooperation with the investigation. Second version. According to this version, the maniac was nevertheless sentenced to death by firing squad in another country. Based on this version, the authorities should have issued official confirmation, but this has not yet happened. Third version. The BBC conducted its investigation and concluded that Lopez was released from prison in 1998 and was extradited to Colombia. After that, he allegedly disappeared and cannot be found to this day. In 2006, Lopez entered the Guinness Book of Records as the most prolific killer. Soon its management received many complaints from people who considered the Maniac's achievements to be direct propaganda for murder. Others noted that Lopez is not a record holder at all. They cited as an example Tug Biram, who, according to unconfirmed reports, killed about 900 people in India. After all these claims, it was decided to cancel the serial killer's record. Most likely, Lopez is still alive, but whether he continues to kill is unknown. He would be 72 years old at this point, so he could very well retire. Now that you know the story of Peter Lopez, you probably have two feelings. On the one hand, he was a ruthless maniac who killed hundreds of people. No matter what led him down this path, it is simply impossible to look for an excuse for what he did. But once you look at Lopez's biography, you can't help but wonder. But he would have become a monster if his childhood had turned out differently. The boy never had a loving family, his mother sold her body for money for food. And throughout his growing up, he repeatedly became a victim of sadists. His story is a dead end in the viewer's head, because there is no one right answer. Cruelty begets cruelty. And this is a problem of our world as a whole, and not of an individual maniac.